The views and opinions heard on this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
My breathing had stopped for so long that my heart actually ended up stopping.
You saw what I did. You said that I was going to die.
And then I remember being gone. I wasn't there anymore.
I sort of lifted up about 6 feet above my body.
A pinprick of light appeared and came rushing toward me faster than the speed of light.
And then this light, all of a sudden it was all completely around me.
He says, I am God. Yes, I am real.
The main message was loving yourself and loving others.
It was clearly shown to me.
It was really hard to put into words. It felt like I had been there before.
It was just this very personal, impersonal, unconditional love.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. I am your host, Lamont Gates, bringing you the world of faith, metaphysicality, and spirituality. Today, my guest discovered that what lies within the spiritual realm does not necessarily remain in such place, and that in this life, the spirit is a consistent guide. Let's get it started. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Lamont Gates, and joining us via Skype is near-death experiencer and author, Elizabeth Maxim. Elizabeth, welcome to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
Hello, thank you for having me on your show.
Amazing to have you here, and I just want to talk about the interesting occurrence of how our paths crossed. I had just come off of the heels of doing an interview with a guest who mentioned an encounter with an archangel in her near-death experience named Metatron, which then led me, out of curiosity, to do a probe online for more near-death experiencers who may have come in contact with this particular entity. And I ended up finding your website, and I realized that you are a sci-fi writer, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes, and going through your website, I saw that you put together a series of books entitled Metatron's Army, to which you say was inspired by your near-death experience, which caught my attention immediately. I also saw on your website that as a young child, you believed that this earthly reality, for example, was not the only reality that there was. You believed in sort of other dimensions as a young child, which I thought was very profound. So let's start right there. Prior to your near-death experience, why don't you tell us some of the religious and or spiritual influences you had growing up as a child? What were you taught? What was your complete belief system like?
Okay, so I was raised Irish Catholic, went to a Roman Catholic school taught by nuns who had escaped communist Poland after World War II. So quite a few different cultural influences there, but I was also in a family where second sight and seeing ghosts and having paranormal experiences was culturally acceptable. And that's what led me to believe that there were other dimensions. I could see and know things before they happened. I saw ghosts, so I did have that. However, I did not believe in angels per se. I knew the story of Archangel Michael and Gabriel from the Bible and believed those were experiences people had. But when we used to stand next to our desk and pray to our guardian angel, I'd look at the empty space next to me and think, there's nothing there. This is like a fairy tales the nuns are telling us, like a Santa Claus for prayers answered. So I had a hard time with angel concept. I just took any prayers I had directly to God.
So you're saying as a young child, you already had some sort of sixth sensibility?
That's correct. I would know things before they were going to happen, and I occasionally see ghosts.
How old were you when you had your near-death experience?
I was 10.
10 years old, so you were very young. Why don't you tell us exactly how your near-death experience occurred?
Okay, so I was getting dressed one day and all of a sudden had this horrific pain in my head, just a terrible throbbing pain. Ran to my dad. He got my younger brother, put us in the truck to drive me to the hospital. I was laying with my head in my brother's lap, clutching my skull, and I don't know who I was talking to, but I kept saying, please, just let me die, because I was in just agony. And I remember my dad saying, you're not going to die. Well, he pulls up over the lawn of the hospital, picks me up, kicks the door of the ER open and says, coming through. The next thing I remember, I'm looking down at my dad taking a doctor over to me where I was lying on this gurney and showing him that my eyes were fixed and dilated. Then I was in a kind of a gray, darkish place where I was aware that I was alive, but I couldn't see or hear or speak. And I remember being very afraid that I was going to be left alone. And I remember thinking, please don't let them leave me. I'm not dead. The next thing I know, I'm looking up at a surgical light and hearing like a buzzing sound that they were shaving my head for surgery. Then I was in this incredibly brightly lit space, and God was there. And so was my Aunt Jan, who had died 11 months to the day before. And there were some other relatives there that had passed on before that knew me. I didn't recognize them. And they were also happy to see me. And then God, who I always described as looking like all the colors of the rainbow, and imagine like a soap bubble, but if it was sort of flat and rather than circular, kind of amoeba shaped, and it pulsed with light and love. And he communicated it wasn't my time yet. But before I went back, there was this other being that was there that was very intense feeling. And it showed me a whole bunch of information kind of at the speed of light, went by images, mathematical symbols, things that were technology that I didn't recognize because they hadn't been invented yet. And after this information just came at me like water from a fire hose, I was told I had to go back. And then this being, this really intense being that was there said, you don't have to be afraid. I'll always be with you. Then I was back where those other spirits were, my aunt and those other people. And behind them, there was this like camera aperture opening. And I could see through it into our world, our dimension. And then I was sucked through. And the next thing I know, I'm waking up in intensive care, and one of the first things I told my parents was, I saw God and Aunt Jan.
So you had a classic near-death experience, it seems. Did you see any other light beings?
Yes, they were very difficult to describe to people. They were as if you took a candle flame and you stretched it really long and tall, like 12 feet tall kind of a thing. Very hard to describe, but that was what they felt like.
So you left your body, you were able to see below you within the physical realm, around you. You came into contact with deceased relatives, received rapid information, and heard that famous phrase, it's not your time. What was all of this like when you came back and attempted to communicate it to others?
It was incredibly difficult because a lot of people had a preconceived idea of what heaven was like, of what happened to us after we died. And my descriptions didn't fit that outside that I'd seen my Aunt Jan and that God was there and the light part. But when I tried explaining any of the science of the equations or the technology or the light beings or the intensity, it upset people. And a lot of times they would come back and say, well, don't you mean this? And don't you mean that? Trying to, kind of make me have what their version of it was because it brought them into their comfort zone. And I said, no, that's not how it was. So I ended up not talking about it because of that. It was very frustrating. I know when I went back to school, one of the first things I said to the teacher, who's a nun, I said, you lied to us. I said, there's no guy up there with a white beard handing out merits and demerits. It's not like, the Catholics are the only ones up there. There's nothing but incredible love for everybody.
And I'm sure that was very difficult for them to fathom because at this point, unlike you, they were still static in their traditional religious frame of mind.
Yeah, they were very upset with me, and it went pretty badly in Catholic school after that for me. But I just I was done with it. I was done with that religion after that. I felt very betrayed. I thought, you've got this God that you preach as unconditional love, and that's what it really is. But they limited what that definition meant, and I'd experienced it real hand, and it was the most wonderful, warm, loving feeling. It was for everybody.
Talk to us now about this concept for the book series you wrote concerning this archangel who was believed in ancient rabbinical literature and even by many Kabbalists today. How did Metatron come about in all of this?
So I was in geometry class in 10th grade, and I was looking out the window and saw this. I thought at the time it was a ghost. It was a male with dark hair. And I was listening to the teacher lecture on some geometric principles we were going to have on a test. And she wrote the definition of a plane, a geometric plane, and drew it on the board. And as I looked over, all of a sudden, I saw all these geometry images and all this math and all this information came piling in. And then this voice said, that's not true. That's not how it is. And then more information of what it really was. So I waited until after class, went up and told her that definition is wrong. And I drew out what was correct. And she smiled and said, well, this is what's going to be on the test, so you better study it. And when I went home, I just continued to write down and draw out everything that had been downloaded in that class. And out of it came the story for Metatron's army, because I was using that as a way to make sense of all this science and math that I hadn't yet gone to the classes to understand. And that is kind of how it was born. And then over the years, as I added my knowledge, because I studied math and science in order to better understand it, talking to physics teachers, engineers, anybody I could, I filled in more gaps in the story.
Did this entity ever label itself Metatron? Was this the high intensity level being you believe you saw in your near-death experience?
I didn't realize it at the time, but I've come to see that it is the same entity, and he's been with me over the years, making appearances, usually when things are really rough in my life. And how it came about to be where he explained Metatron is in a two-part piece. I was living in San Diego, and I was already writing. I was actually writing on EMF sensitivity. And this voice said, I want you to publish that story being what is now Metatron's army. And at the time, I said, are you out of your mind? No. I mean, I'm crazy. Do you know how much work that would be? That's over 35 years worth of stuff put together, and it was so intimidating to me. There was a silence, and then that wasn't a question. And I thought, oh, you. I recognized that voice and that intense energy as someone that periodically in my life has told me to do things, and I didn't always listen, and told me not to do things, and again, I didn't always listen. And when I didn't listen, it didn't go very well for me. So not long before it, energy came around and said, you ready to listen now? And I said, oh, yeah. So I realized I'm dealing with that energy. And I said, okay, fine, but you're going to have to wait because I've got these other books. And when I do, I'm going to need help. You're going to have to help me. And he agreed. So I was working on Advantage, which was the first book in Metatron's Army series. Didn't have a title for the series yet. And I thought, well, I'll see if that guy was serious about helping me. So I said, I need some help with the title, and immediately got the answer, Metatron's Army. And I thought, oh, that's kind of catchy. I like that. So I looked up Metatron and saw that he was an archangel. And I thought, oh man, I wish I would have known this before I started this book, because I'd put in a piece about Archangel Michael. And the voice said, keep reading. And as I read, I saw that in certain texts, Metatron is Archangel Michael. And I got this chill at that moment. And I thought, oh my God, this is real. This entity is real, and he's helping me. And through the course of doing the book, the entity stayed very close. Again, I just had been calling him that guy because I didn't have a name. And two things happened during that. Starting around book 9 through book 11, I felt like I was remembering rather than writing. A lot of the near-death experience stuff came back. One of the things was one of the equations that I remember seeing that he'd wanted me to solve. I was working on an exercise that eventually became an app that I wrote called Event Horizon. In fact, Metatron gave me the name for that one too. And the entity appeared to me in front of me. He had dark hair, and he had the equation written on a blackboard that kind of just appeared. And I, in my mind's eye, and he said, "It's time for you to solve this now." So I wrote a couple of the symbols down because I wanted to verify what I was dealing with. And I ran over to Aaron, who is a double E and a math genius. I said, "That's calculus, isn't it?" He said, "Yeah, that's calculus." So I told him what was going on and went back. And as I started to work through it, the equation animated and the numbers changed and this information just poured out. And the equation was solved, and it was a translation key that I've been able to use since to better communicate with Metatron. And it was at this point I started to put two and two together that that's what this entity was. And I asked him, and he said, "Yeah, that is me." And he never minded that I just referred to him as that guy. I think because, I was a child and I grew up through the years. And after that, we got much better with communications and things.
Now, earlier you mentioned having certain extraordinary gifts as a child prior to your near-death experience. Do you believe this entity played a role with you at this stage or only after your near-death experience?
There is one experience I had in second grade that I now realize was Metatron, and I did not know it at the time. I was sitting at my desk looking out the window, and this voice, I had just gotten into an argument with the nun over something. They don't like it when you ask questions they can't answer. And I was feeling kind of dejected frustrated, not having these answers. And this voice said, "Talk to me. Come to me. Don't listen to them. Come to me, and I'll make sure you get your questions answered." And he said, "Now, I may use a nun or a priest to give you the answer, but if you have questions, come to me." I now realize in hindsight that was that entity. Additionally, when I was in high school, this is around the time after the geometry experience, something woke me up at 10 after 3 in the morning. And I turned and looked next to my bed, and there was a figure standing there dressed in a purple fur-lined cloak, long dark hair, smiling at me, glowing with love, had pants and boots that kind of went up over the knee on kind of a medieval. And I turned and looked at my clock, and it was about 3:12, and I looked back, and the figure was just standing there. I thought at the time it was a ghost, but now I realize that was Metatron. And he was, I think, announcing he was going to be in my life, because right after that, that's when the whole thing with Metatron's army started, and he took a real strong interest in my desire to be a writer.
Many people say that when they return from a near-death experience, they come back with certain gifts. For example, precognition, they may have a sixth sense, they may have certain sensitivities, for example, to light. Time may stop. For example, a watch that they're wearing on their wrist may stop working. I know that you already said you had these particular gifts prior to your near-death experience, but do you believe anything was strengthened after your near-death experience? Did you notice anything different about your gifts after your experience?
Yes, after the near-death experience, the ghost sightings multiplied quite a bit. I started to have psychic dreams where I would know things about people. I would know things that were going to happen. I got clairaudience, as well, which was something that was very difficult for me to adjust to, hearing these conversations in my head. And everything was magnified and amplified, and I got EMF sensitivity to a degree. I would break batteries, drain them, break equipment, break printers, all sorts of chaos around equipment, what they call the gremlin effect.
Well, let's hope none of that occurs during this interview, but I do understand the technological anomalies many experiencers say they face. You mentioned how this entity aids you in your art of writing. How exactly has this entity placed its imprint on your artwork?
Well, it's very interesting because I created a story to go around the things that I had seen and the impressions that I had. And I was in school, I was in my room one day, and all of a sudden this figure with dark hair appears next to my bed and looks at me, and he's very, very intense and says, "That's not how it went." And I was really thrown by that because this was stuff I was making up in my mind. And I had 5 characters that are part of the story now that were the original. And 3 of them, the relationship they had, and he said, "No, that's not how it went." And he redid that part of the story. And I wasn't really happy with that because, well, it kind of, like I said, it confused me a bit because I thought, wait a minute, I'm making this up, aren't I? But he had a very strong opinion about how it should go. So I did rewrite it, and I thought, okay, I guess I can work with this. And as I was getting to a point in which, again, this was book 9 with the series, it came time to make some things happen. And I didn't really like the way that it was going to be going. So I thought maybe I won't have to do this with these characters because it was something kind of sad. And he showed up again and said, I thought we went over this. And have you forgotten? That's not the way it went. So I just threw up my hands. I said, okay, fine. I'll go with the story that way. That's sort of hard to explain for me because I felt like, I was the one writing the story. But as I mentioned, between book 9 and book 11, it felt like a memory more than a creative, organic thing. And towards the end of Metatron's Army, when the series was winding down, he said, "I have another series I want you to do." And so he had me go over to the computer and look a few things up and on the web. And I said, okay, well, I can't do it exactly like this. And we had a bit of an argument. And I said, look, I'm the writer. You're going to have to trust me on this. I have to have the creative license. I understand what you want me to get across. I understand the theme. You're just going to have to trust me on this. So we kind of negotiate, I guess you could say, when we're working together. But he's definitely front and center in my writing career.
This entity seems to help you decide things in your artistic work. Does it ever help you decide things in your personal life as well?
Absolutely. That one has been kind of an interesting thing, too. In 1994, I was in Washington, D.C. for some training. I was getting ready to join some colleagues for dinner, and all of a sudden I heard this really deep voice. I said, "You will move to California." And I looked around the room, and there was nobody there. And I thought, okay, great. But I didn't do anything to make it happen. So a couple months later, I was in Pittsburgh for a different training. I got a phone call, and the voice on the other end, this guy says, "You don't know me, but I know you. And there's this job in California I think you'd be perfect for." Well, I already had a vacation scheduled out to the Bay Area to visit a friend. And so I did the job interview while I was out there. And a month later, I was living in California. I did not consciously do anything to make it happen. And that's not the last time he said something. And in fact, when we got married, I tried to give my husband a heads up of what he was in for being married to a psychic like that. And so I said one day I came home from a walk where Metatron had said, "You're not staying here long," which is where we were living. And we had just closed on a house. I said, "You couldn't have told me this before?" So things got kind of, chaotic after that. But, Aaron said, "Well, anytime you hear any message like that, let me know." And so, yeah, he has guided us quite a bit. And a good place for us to live, places where I could heal from the EMF sensitivity, and a number of other things. Yeah, he's very front and center in my life as a guide.
You spoke about the opposition from clergy to your views as a child. Many times clergy make enemies out of alternative views. Likewise, scientists, for example, also tend to make spirituality into an enemy. What would you say to those now about how there is an all-loving God and that consciousness actually does truly survive death, to those who are on the fence about these particular concepts?
Well, I don't consider myself like a preacher kind that tries to convince people, but I would impress upon them that God is non-judgmental, that there is unconditional love for everybody, and that there's, if people are resisting the idea, I would ask them not to tell me, but to ask themselves, why did they feel threatened by the idea that that might be the case? What's so bad about the idea of being with the people that you love that have passed on before you, or with these beings that welcomed you with open arms and unconditional love?
And it certainly speaks to our human biases. We just don't want to be wrong. Certain alternative views tend to pose threats to long-held beliefs. So tell us where someone could find your work, specifically Metatron's Army, in case they wanted to get more info about your near-death experience in a sci-fi style.
Okay, so I have metatronsarmy.com, which all the books that are related to that series are found there. And then I also have elizabethmaxim.com, which gives a list of the different series I do, the type of writer I am, gives a bit of a background of my career. That would have Dragon Core on it, Ghost Games, and a new series that I'm working on now, Colony, which I got the idea for at the same time that I got Metatron's Army, and Metatron definitely was helping me back then with that one too.
Well, Elizabeth, I want to thank you for coming on Real Spiritual Talk Radio and sharing your account. I do believe many listeners will be spiritually enlightened by it.
Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Maxim. And I want to thank you all for tuning in once again to another episode of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. Please catch me on my Facebook page, Real Spiritual Talk Radio, and there you will find past shows as well as other relevant near-death experience information. I am always enlightened by these accounts, and I hope that you too are becoming much more spiritually enlightened. And with that said, I am your host, Lamont Gates, and Real Spiritual Talk Radio is now signing off.